He was beginning to wish he'd stayed at home. As Walker stepped off the train onto an unfamiliar platform, thunder rumbled like a celestial laugh at his expense, and he wondered if things could get any worse. He'd only just set off on the 2-hour journey back home when the train had ground to a halt, and for 20 minutes left him none the wiser, with a damp chill eating into his bones, and a view of some rather sorry-looking trees stooping towards the train as if they sought some kind of shelter from a downpour. At last, an announcement came. The train would be going no further. It would leave him at the next station, and from there he would have to wait for a connecting service. There had been some kind of disruption on the main line. Soaking wet through and with a mood that had gone from furious to near martyrdom over the course of the day, Walker watched the stubby train pull away from the platform and disappear amidst the dripping trees. Of course, he would be the only passenger. At least this platform had a waiting room, and he'd have it all to himself. He slung his camera and his backpack over his shoulder and marched over to it. The door, flaking red paint and frosted glass, opened stiffly, exhaling a fetid blast of stale air, and worse. Musing on mankind's inexplicable desire to piss in any kind of enclosed public space, he stepped inside and allowed the door to drift shut behind him. There was an overhead light that was so grimy and full of dead flies that it seemed only to highlight the gloom. The walls were painted green, as if to bring the foliage in here. Perhaps that was why everything looked so damp and unappealing. Metal benches that looked only slightly more comfortable than standing lined the walls, and he sat himself down in the furthest corner, facing the door. There were 2 small windows, one either side of the door, but the glass was milky and blind as a cataract. Anything beyond vague shadows and a general idea of a daylight or lack of it would be impossible to discern. There was a further strip of windows running across the back wall, though these had no doubt been intended for ventilation, as they were 7 feet from the floor, very narrow and also of frosted glass. Disuse had sealed them shut. All in all, he was unpleasantly closed in. The only diversions were a newspaper that was probably at least weeks old, that was scattered across the floor and trodden into a soggy pulp, and a no-smoking notice that somebody, or various somebodies, had touched up with cigarette burns. He'd better check on the time of the next, for all he knew the only train. In here he'd never see anything coming. He set his belongings down on the bench and walked back out into a drizzle to confront the timetable. Thunder snarled. Rain sliced at the platform. Walker stared at the timetable until it made sense. The train that would take him a third of the way home was still another 40 minutes away. Feeling temporarily numb to any more unpleasant news, he stumped back into the waiting room. If anything, it seemed colder in here than it had done outside, but he'd had more than enough of the rain for today. It had come quite literally out of blue. The sky had darkened so quickly he'd thought something wrong with his eyes. Then the clouds had grown too heavy and split wide open to drench the countryside. He was foolishly prepared for walking. His jeans had turned black from the soaking, and his coat had lost whatever waterproof qualities it might have had some years ago. He'd taken the opportunity of what he'd thought a fine, clear day to travel out and take some photographs and notes for a book he'd been intermittently working on about the English countryside whenever his job allowed him the free time. By the time he'd made his way out of the forest, across the lake by ferry and up the long road to the train station, he felt drenched not only by the rain but by the pitying and amused looks he was receiving. Was that somebody else out on a platform? He raised his face towards the door as he listened, but there was only the wind sweeping by outside with a mournful cry, rattling the doors and windows in their frames. Anything that followed could only have been leaves and twigs cast by the wind. It sounded far too insubstantial to be people. Walker checked his watch and tried to calculate how long it might take him to reach home now. There was no point. He was only familiar with the times of a direct service. He knew only that he would get home very late. The thought weighed on his mind like an extra layer of dampness. His clothes felt as though they had been pasted to his skin. Somebody laughed, and he glanced back up at the door just in time to see a shape as thin as a bundle of sticks hurry by outside. What nonsense! He'd only just been out on a platform, and it had been as bleak and lonely as he was starting to feel. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. Another of his frustrations was that he'd neglected to pack a lunch, intending to round off the day in a pub somewhere with an open fireplace, plenty of food and a bottle of wine. The rain had chased him away from any such relaxation and washed him up here. It drummed on the roof like fingers, hissed like snakes in the woods. It trickled down his clothes and made him sneeze. The noise, loud and unexpected as a gunshot, echoed from the walls of a waiting room and dislodged others. Wasn't there a voice just beyond the window and a reply that sounded more like sobbing? He tried to concentrate upon his own thoughts of getting home, a warm, dry bed. Whatever was going on outside needn't concern him. He thought back over his day in the forest above the lake. Pleasant enough walk before the rain came down, and he managed to take a few good shots before the darkness had swept in over the mountains. His thoughts were going round in circles. He became aware that he was trying and largely failing not to listen to whoever or whatever was outside the waiting room. Why should it concern him? Whatever it was had fallen quiet again anyway, leaving only the hiss of the rain, the occasional lament of the wind and the low complaint of the thunder. With a sigh, he looked up from the floor just as a group of shadows swept across the windows, just clouds. They hadn't enough substance to be much else. The waiting room was growing darker by the minute around him, burying him in musty shadows. His thoughts were becoming increasingly despondent, little surprise in his current circumstances, but there was more than that. It was as though, since he'd arrived here, the storm had brought about a darkening of his spirits, as well as the end of a pleasant day. As though it was blowing an ill wind from further down the tracks. Beyond the unpleasant odours of the waiting room, he thought he could detect the odour of something else. It wasn't the scent of rain, nor of a damp and dripping vegetation. There seemed to be something burning, or burnt, nearby. Despite himself, but before he could rein in his imagination, he wondered about the nature of the disruption on the main line, and at that moment, a charred and blackened figure flattened itself against the window. Walker thrust himself backwards against the bench, cried out before he could help it. The figure against the window, however, seemed to be nothing more than wind-swept leaves from the forest, for the next gust scattered it into fragments and left the window filled only with a fading daylight. Though he tried to laugh at the illusion, his heart was pounding, and the start it had given him left him feeling queasy. More leaves, twigs or litter blew along the platform outside, scraping like claws. The burnt smell seemed closer. He must hope that this would not bring any further delay to his journey. He allowed himself to settle back against the hard metal of the bench and tried to ignore how it pressed the remnants of dampness from his clothes deeper into his skin. He stared at the floor until he began to doze, and then pulled himself upright with a lurch. This was neither the time nor the place to sleep, as much as he suddenly felt like it. He didn't dare to imagine the night that lay in wait for him if he missed this train. He wished he'd brought a book to read, something to keep himself from falling into the long, dark spaces that were growing like fungus in his mind. He wished for some company at least, but when he heard footsteps on the platform outside, he just as quickly regretted his wish. They were rushing to get out of the rain, of course, and only the puddles could make the footsteps sound so sodden and squelching. But the haste seemed far too eager. There was something unpleasant in the scrambling gait, and Walker found himself holding his breath and unable to release it until long after the steps had faded away. If there had indeed been somebody out there, then they'd gone back into the rain, but he suspected he'd been mistaken about the nature of a presence, after all. He hadn't thought it possible to feel so alone and yet watched. If he was being watched, though, he couldn't imagine where from. The windows were turning black as smoke as the evening aged. Perhaps it was only the threat of a dream, for sleep seemed to be spreading across him like damp. He almost closed his eyes and surrendered to it. This sudden weariness made him feel strangely dissociated from his body. What must that be like, he thought, to suddenly lose your body? He thought of a consciousness, or those of many, wrenched free from suits of flesh and blood all of a sudden. Some would be scared by the experience, some distraught, others driven insane. For some, it would be too fresh to come to terms with. He jerked awake. What was he thinking? Souls grieving for themselves and lost in the night? He felt gripped by panic, but only about how much time he'd let pass, for already it was pitch black outside. Surely he'd have heard the train. He couldn't be left out here overnight with what? It was all right, he told himself, but he only meant for time. There was still 15 minutes before the train was due. There was a formless lowing sound from out of the forest that could have been a train's horn, but was more likely just the wind, and yet which did not sound like either. He shivered, and then he sneezed, which helped him to believe that the shiver was merely caused by the damp. It was strange, though, that he no longer felt quite as cold as he had done earlier. In fact, there was something warm about the waiting room now. He glanced sharply up at the high windows, thinking that he'd seen movement beyond them. The trees, of course, as what he'd thought he'd seen, had been black and twisted, and yet now he could see only an unpleasant pale smear across the glass, which he was sure hadn't been there before. It looked as though something had been thrown or pressed itself against the glass and slid away, leaving bits of itself behind. As he was staring, thunder muttered, and something reared up into sight behind the smear. He could tell himself several reasons why what he was seeing could not be a face. The window was too high. There was nothing on that side of the building but dripping leaves. It looked like something incomplete trying to be a face, but none of them reassured him in the least. They only made the apparition more horrific, and then, with a laugh that sounded like the crackle of fire, it melted back to the darkness. He threw himself to his feet, though he was far from certain what he wanted to do. He couldn't head outside into the dark and the rain, trapped on a deserted platform, whilst whatever was out there clambered across the building like a giant spider. Was there more than one of them? He had heard voices, or something like voices earlier, and sounds that had no words amongst them, only raw emotion. Perhaps thinking about them was as much of an invocation as was needed. For here came another of them, clambering up the adjacent wall to press a face he was glad he couldn't see better against the filthy glass. And now he was surrounded by sounds from outside, furtive whispers, mocking laughter, and what he hoped were only branches scraping across the roof. Standing in the middle of a waiting room, Walker began to turn slowly, his gaze roaming across the door and each of the windows. They were as fleeting as shadows cast by fire and brought with them the smell of smoke. His mind felt pressed with unwelcome thoughts. some of which he was less able to hold back than others. He imagined the waiting room going up in flames whilst he was trapped inside. Was that what they wanted to do to him? As soon as he opened his mind to what was going on in theirs, he pictured flames, huge walls of fire, choking smoke, white-hot flames reaching out to claw at him as he screamed helplessly for his life. This was ridiculous. Where were such thoughts coming from? Just like the damp blanket of hopeless despair he'd felt earlier, they seemed to have blown out of the forest with the wind and the rain, blown like a scrap of litter or a charred leaf to wash up on the platform. Perhaps if that's all they were, then he was safe inside. If all they were was a surge of unfortunate emotion blown away from whatever tragedy had overtaken them, then these four walls could shelter him as effectively as from the wind and rain. He turned on his heels as something bumped against the high windows. Another face, though it was more like a mask because he could have sworn there was nothing behind its eye sockets, and as it moved away after leering at him, it appeared to leave something more than smears on the glass. He couldn't stay in here forever, or even until more of a night came. He would be driven out of his mind with fear. Not knowing exactly what he had to be afraid of just made it all the worse. The train would be here soon. It had to be here soon. They couldn't leave him out here all night. And then, he questioned himself, when it comes, what then? Much as he wanted to get away from this place, Walker could not bring himself to think about opening the door and stepping outside. Could that be the train now? Certainly there was a light playing on the glass of the door, becoming increasingly brighter, and a sound beyond the ragged chorus of sobs and whispers that could have been a soft roar. But if anything, the effect was more like that of fire. The light was not steady, it danced and flickered, and more than ever there was the smell of something horrendously burned, or burning, just outside. If the emotions he'd been sensing were coming from elsewhere, then the overwhelming fear that he was feeling might not be entirely his own, and he mustn't let it stop him from getting to the train. He closed his hand upon the door handle, though didn't know whether to wrestle it open or to hold it shut when he felt something working against it from the other side. They were afraid, that was all, but people in a state of fear could be dangerous. Perhaps all the more so when they were dead. The light from outside was throwing the most unpleasant shadows across the panes of glass just inches from his face. Twisted forms appeared to dance, but only in the way that flames did. Fingers that might have been every bit as black as their silhouettes clawed at the glass. He heard the voices, laughing, weeping, pleading, snarling, but he couldn't allow himself to listen, for somewhere beneath it all, in the omnipotent rumble of a thunder, he could hear the train. Walker allowed no time for second thoughts. He forced his weight down upon the door handle and spilled out onto the platform. It ought to be cold, but it was unthinkably hot. It ought to be dark, but there was a flickering luminescence. In the split second before he squeezed his eyes shut, he saw only enough to haunt his dreams forevermore, and yet not enough to be certain of exactly what he'd seen. Before the train dragged itself from out of the forest and frightened them away, he felt them too, and in some ways that was as bad as seeing them had been. They gripped him with fingers that crumbled like charred wood, caressed his face with a touch like dry leaves. Perhaps they'd used the forest to patch themselves together again, for when he opened his eyes to struggle into the carriage as the train lurched to a halt, he found himself wading through a good deal of leaves and mulch that had blown in with him. As though eager to be out of the woods, the train was moving before he'd even collapsed into a seat. The carriage was empty, as was what he could see of the next one through the door at the end. The gloomy lights flickered fitfully. He caught sight of his reflection in the window and turned away with a cry. It wasn't so much the sight of his disembodied face seeming to float through the forest alongside the train. It was the host of others that surrounded it, out there in the night.